everyone, this is Dr. Liz, and you're listening to Include with Dr. Liz. This show is about everyone, all people, including you. It's about people and their diverse lived experience in this world. I chat with guests to get to know them, their identities, and their inclusion needs, so we all have an opportunity to understand how best to include them, so together we can create a world where everyone thrives. Terrance is a travelling, go-getting, authentic natural connector who doesn't like pies. Growing up with both parents in the Airforce, Terrance identifies as an ethnic, racial, cultural and religious minority and with a cognitive disability. His passion is working with people to improve their lives. Welcome, Terrance.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Liz. Glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely thrilled to have you. We've already had a really great chat before we even pressed.
We have.
Apparently you love to travel. What has been your favorite travel destination?
Oh, I will say my favorite travel destination would be Salt Lake City. And I know that might kind of surprise people, but I feel like everybody talks about, Phoenix and Denver and a lot of people moving there. But in Salt Lake City, you have all the beautiful views, and everywhere you look, you're surrounded by mountains. So I would say that's the prettiest.
Well, that's definitely on my to-do list since it's basically neighboring to Colorado. So I can't wait.
There it is. You should visit.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so in advance of this podcast, every guest completes a questionnaire, and there was a big long list of identities, and you ticked 6 of them. Which ones were they for you?
Sure. So thank you so much for that intro, and you covered the majority of them. But again, my name is Terrence Ferguson. I identify as male. I am an ethnic minority, racial minority, cultural minority, religious minority, and my cognitive disability is ADHD, which I actually got diagnosed my senior year of high school, so pretty late. But I would say those are the categories that I would fit.
Thank you so much for sharing those. Now, I also know a little bit more about this racial and ethnic minority. How do you identify within that category?
Sure, it's fascinating. So, you and I were just talking about those states out west, and I was actually born in New Mexico. So, both of my parents were in the Air Force. My mom was born in Manila, Philippines, and my dad was born in Albany, New York. So, having an Asian mother and an African American father definitely created some quick understanding and speed to proficiency when it came to kind of speaking on what my identity was like.
So actually, this, I think, really does create an interesting topic of conversation because from an outsider and how I look at you, someone is going to say African American or Black American, right? That's their assumption they're going to apply as an identity to you. But 50% of you is Filipino. So where do you sit within that?
And it's fascinating because our audience wasn't privy to what you and I chatted about before. But with you, you're speaking, you have a slight accent to an American listener. But if they were to look at you, they'd say, okay, she fits the profile of what I think an American would look like, right? So, of course, this is the juxtaposition between race and ethnicity. And for me, ethnicity, of course, is your demographic of your parents, as we just identified. So for me, it's fascinating. My Thanksgivings, if you can imagine, I have my mom rolling the egg rolls and just making all the Asian food. And my dad makes his just prized potato salad and his yams, and it's the best of both worlds. But when you look at race, it's a social construct, right? So here in the United States, I could be perceived as Black, but if I were to go to the continent of Africa, I could be perceived as light skinned or something else. So I will say the perception is fascinating. And that's why I think that your podcast of learning about different types of people and kind of their inner and outer, I think it's good to know holistically, so we don't typically just jump to those conclusions that our brain is kind of short circuited to do.
So you talked about that beautiful combination of the Asian food, yum, which I kind of miss being in Colorado, to be honest. When I was back in Australia, there's abundance of it. So you've got this best of both worlds. You've got some Asian culture and you've got the American and or African American culture being brought together. How does that manifest itself in you? So yeah, in food, but then how else does it make you who you are?
Of course, I'm going to use kind of the term when we generalize. So we say Asian, of course, we're talking about the entire continent. Specifically for Filipino, I will say it's a very regimented, strict culture. when it comes to, for example, using spending money, right? Not spending a lot of money, always looking for those discounts. Nothing can be the normal price that we buy. Um, and I think that that, of course, is accentuated when that person is also a military
Mm,
member and in the Air Force.
mm.
And then for my dad, very laid back, very go with the flow, but a lot of that discipline, strong work ethic. And I think myself as a millennial, those are sometimes lost arts. So I
Mm.
think that that kind of ingrained discipline from birth forward definitely advised me to kind of build some of those skills, especially going into the business environment.
You perfectly articulated intersectionality there, because
Yes.
then it's not just about the ethnic or racial identity. Then you're
Mhm.
talking about the lived experience of
Yep.
growing up with parents in the military. So you talked about some of the things, well, one of the things with discipline being a really great advantage of being
Mhm.
raised by military parents. Um, any disadvantages?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm a very self-aware person, so I will say I think that I am structured to a fault. I think that sometimes I could appear as kind of rigid. And just from a business perspective, I know you and I kind of discussed this a little bit earlier, but I've worked for Fortune 500 companies, and then I currently work for a startup scale up. Right. So in those types of organizations, I may have a question like, okay, so where is XYZ located? And in a startup or a scale up, it may not be available. So that's where that person needs to make sure that they're independent and kind of coming up with those resources on their own. So I
Mm.
definitely feel like there are some cons of what could be considered a strength. And I think that's where self-awareness comes in and just kind of knowing where somebody else is coming from.
In the movies, I hear the term military brat. How does
Yep.
that make you feel when people use that language?
I am one of those people, if the shoe fits, wear it, and I 100% am a military brat. I will tell you, it's funny, the Air Force, if you have any military listeners, they are known as having like the swankiest kind of rooms and barracks and a lot of those kind of really nice ways of living. I will say I'm definitely a brat to a degree of I'm so proud of my parents fighting for our country, and even when they're out of service, definitely commending them and making sure that everybody appreciates what they've done for us.
Did you have to travel a lot as when you were growing up?
I will be honest with you. Luckily, I've only lived, or before my parents moved around, only 3 states. So from New Mexico, moved to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, and then when they got out of the service, moved to Tennessee, which is home for me.
Can you think of a time when perhaps you didn't feel included?
Mm.
You felt like you didn't belong. What was that experience, and why do you think that was?
It's fascinating, doctor, because my middle school was almost all black public school here in Tennessee. And then my parents were like, you know what? I really want for Terrence and his brother to go to the best school available. So in high school, I went to an almost all white boarding school. So when you look at that juxtaposition of becoming the minority and being, or excuse me, the majority and then going to the minority, I will be honest with you, based on my personality, I was easily able to assimilate, right? So
Mm,
assimilate meaning able to kind of match the modes of interaction with the majority group. But I will say that's why the importance of your earlier questions of knowing the person internally,
mm,
because they would say, "Oh, so you're half Asian," and my boarding school had people from all over. And if somebody were to see that commonality that may not be visceral,
mm.
then via those questions and some of those probing kind of inquiries, you could get to know a different side of someone.
Yeah. Do you think you had different educational outcomes from going to the private schooling versus the all black school prior to that?
Yes, and it's funny. Your listeners are probably like, they probably talked for an hour before this, but in our probably 10 minutes before, Dr. Liz, you mentioned the word privilege. And I think it's important to discuss that word because privilege transcends just race or
Mm,
it transcends just your gender. But to me, if you are afforded any education, especially in the Western environment, that is a privilege in itself. And an accentuated version of that privilege is if you're going to a boarding school, right? So clearly, there's some type of resource that is available to you that others maybe were not available to them.
mm,
So I will be honest with you. I think from that perspective, I definitely felt like it gave me a leg up because then the schools that I applied to, they're like, wow, he has this boarding school experience. And then, of course, he definitely brings something to the table. So I definitely do think I got a leg up in that
Mm.
regard.
Are you in contact with any people still from the original school? And can you
My middle
see,
school.
yeah, can you see a difference in professional outcomes?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes is the answer. And yes, I think, without kind of getting too deep into it, I do think that schooling is one of the facets that really create that foundational launching pad for someone to have a career. So if you look at schooling, the neighborhood that someone lives in, the connections that they have based on their family. If you look at all those connections, that inherently is some type of privilege if your answer is yes to those categories.
Mm.
So I think with schooling being one of those facets, it absolutely will set you apart from maybe a school that is a public school with the insinuation that that public school maybe had less resources or less regard in the world of academia when it comes to kind of matriculating into a college.
What's your take on historically Black colleges and universities as providing an environment for people of color that feels safer and that they can get better educational outcomes?
I love it. I love it. So I did not go to an HBCU, but I will tell you the value of that. And I really appreciate that question, Dr. Liz, because you and I kind of working in the business environment, it makes me think of your business resource groups or your employee resource groups where you have Asian Pacific Islander group or African American group. And those who are of the majority race may say, okay, why do I not have one for me? And in my opinion, when you look at every strata of the environment from a demographic perspective, if one is in the minority, then of course, from a psychological perspective, like attracts like. So those common experiences or those common internal or external vibes you get from someone truly does short circuit your brain to say, can I get along with that person or not?
Mm.
Specifically for HBCUs, if you look at the intent is because when you look at the educational gap, so we just mentioned resources and the inability for some of those who are African American to achieve some of those educational outcomes. Those schools are designed to say, hey, we are looking for fostering the leadership in these particular people. And it's not just HBCU, but you also look at the Divine Nine. So the Divine Nine are fraternities and sororities that are specifically geared toward African Americans. So all that to say is when you look at a group that is a minority, you create an environment that fosters their interaction with one another. I absolutely think that schools like that are integral to allowing for those people to feel like they do have the best foot forward when it goes to their career.
Awesome. Thank you for contributing to that conversation.
Absolutely.
And I remember years ago, my kids are in their 20s now, but when I was choosing their educational options,
Mm,
I, as the geek I am, researched educational outcomes for co-ed schools,
mm,
for single sex schools, and the outcomes for girls is always better than for boys,
mm,
regardless of co-ed girls or boys, because we have a feminized education system. That
mhm,
aside, when you put boys in an all boys school, their outcomes are better. And if you put
mm.
all girls in an all girls school, their outcomes are better. So while I haven't done the research to look at the educational outcomes of people in like an
Boarding
a
school.
no, I'm not good with acronyms. With an HBC,
HBCU. Yes,
it doesn't
you
roll
got
off
it.
the tongue easily for me yet.
Yeah.
It's a new acronym for me. Um, I'm wondering if it's the same thing, right? Because you feel
Mm,
safe, you see people like you see representation of you in front of you with the professors, with in leadership, in the student councils. All of that
mhm.
certainly probably contributes to creating a better educational outcome.
So to your point, I think it's very important, and I'd be really curious to kind of see what that data looks like.
Yeah, and I think as well, if you're not wasting energy on trying to be someone that you're not,
Yes.
and then repurpose that energy into learning and succeeding.
Bingo.
Yeah.
I agree.
I think we've just had a learning moment. Where have you felt like you've most belonged? Where you felt most valuable and you could thrive?
I will say it's, and this might sound a little bit vague, but whenever I'm in a leadership role.
Mhm.
And I think, one of those demographic pieces that we discussed at the top is being a male. And a lot of men tend to tie their self worth and their existence in the real world to their vocation and what they do. So I remember in college, whether I was the leader of a lot of community organized groups, I actually helped co-create and lead this mentoring group for third through fifth grade boys. So we went into under-resourced communities and created this club that it was a chess club, there's a tutoring and mentoring. And those are the moments that are making a tangible impact, but also it's the leadership. And I don't want to really say it's ego, but it's more, I want to know that I played a role in that. So currently, having leadership roles, whether it's in my business resource group, those are when I feel like I belong the most.
And I think while you didn't use the word, I would say that it's about where you feel like you're contributing and you're valued for your
Yes,
contribution.
100%.
And I absolutely believe that that is one of the pinnacles that we have to aspire to for inclusion, that everyone should be heard, that they should be able to contribute and also be valued for their contribution.
I'll also add, something I loved over the past couple years, and Dr. Liz, you probably can add some more light to this, but I think in the past, traditionally, we hear diversity and equity, which is obviously so important, and that's part of the reason we're on this podcast today. But what I've heard more recently is the tack on of that third piece of inclusion.
Oh.
Because if we're being diverse and equitable, great. So maybe that's our hiring practices, right? But when that person is, now in the organization, how are we making sure that they're included so
Mhm.
that our retention is solid so that we can start fostering that development? And I think that third piece of inclusion typically is missed.
I love that you've highlighted that for us, because the thing is, inclusion as a word has been thrown in with diversity, equity, and belonging, and
Mhm,
hasn't really been called out as actually it's the systems, it's the
yeah,
processes, it's the decisions, it's the behaviors and actions. So it's
mhm,
how we create belonging. It's how we
mhm,
get equitable outcomes.
mhm,
Diversity is just bringing in the difference.
mhm,
Inclusion is like this link between them. And I mean, I always say that, what's the point of hiring for diversity if you just bring them into an organization and give them a new opportunity to have a shit experience?
mhm. Couldn't
Um,
agree more.
you need to work on the inclusion. Okay, so I'm going to go back to that list of 6, and one
Mhm,
of those identities was religious minority.
yes.
Can you share what that is for you?
In order to kind of launch toward the religious piece, I have to share just a quick little story.
Please do.
In 2018, I had already graduated college. I was living with some roommates, and the apartment caught on fire. So it was an electrical fire, so it wasn't our doing, but the apartment caught on fire, and I'm like, what is going on in my life? Because everything up until 2017, so I would say 23, 24 years of life was perfect. And I'm like, okay, that's bizarre. Maybe that's just a one-off, occurrence. 2 years later, in 2020, my brother passed away. So I had one brother. He was in the military as well as my parents. He was dealing with bipolar and schizophrenia disorder. And long story short, I received a phone call that he was just found in the water, face up. So just the most mysterious way of passing away. So of course, I had to come home, and if you can imagine doing a funeral or me giving a eulogy during COVID, it was just definitely a different experience when you couldn't see the faces of people reacting to his death. Um, in 2021, I got married to a cardiovascular ICU nurse. So again, that was kind of a happy part, especially considering just kind of those weird shenanigans that's happened before. And then last year, my ex-wife at this point, she was dealing with, again, she was a cardiovascular nurse. Long story short, she had a source of trauma as a child, and she was actually discarded as a baby. So they found her just by herself. So she has a root of trauma as a child. So she's like, you know what, Terrence, this is inspiring me to want to become a nurse, and I want to save lives. So now enter COVID. There's a specific day in February where she's like, I was trying to save these lives and I was unable to save these lives. And then it turned into a lot of suicidal thoughts. So suicidal ideations and lack of self-worth. Fast forward the story. We had conversations, and I'm like, you know what? I appreciate you sharing that with me. Your safety is the number one thing that matters here. But we want to make sure that we're leaning into our faith, we're leaning into mental health resources. Unfortunately, she did not want to look at any therapy or anything. And she's like, to be honest with you, I think I need to focus on my mental health.
Mm,
So for me, I grew up with very strong faith from a young age, and I didn't want to go through with the dissolving of the marriage. But if it was best for her, then that's what I decided to do.
mm,
So fast forward, we ended up getting a divorce or dissolving the marriage in about July or August of last year. And this is where your question about religious comes in. I'm asleep one night and I wake up and my friend texts me at 2:30 in the morning. And he's like, T, I was sleeping and God woke me up in the middle of my sleep to share something with you. So I'm like, okay, well, what did God say? And he's like, Terrence, God told me to tell you that your emotions and your feelings are valid and there's something good on the other side.
mhm,
So I received that. And again, it's interesting because before this conversation, Dr. Liz, I want to read a quick statistic to you
mm,
about mental health.
mm,
26.4% of Black and Hispanic men ages 18 or 44 seek mental health if they have anxiety or depression. So again, that's 26.4%. And that is as opposed to 45.4% of non-Hispanic, non-Black, so white men, right? So that's almost double that number. So for me, that was a spiritual confirmation to say, you know what, I want to tap into making sure that my faith is bolstered during this time and also making sure that I enter therapy. So, all that to say is that is when I started to dive into my support group. So, I have five of my really close friends who live in Cleveland that are very, very close to me that just kind of wrap their arms around me. And then the last piece to this particular story is one of my best friends came to me and was like, Terrence, you're one of the happiest people. We want to make sure that, you got blindsided in this situation. We want to get you out there. And I want to tell you this to your listeners. I'm not going to say the name of the company, but I think a lot of millennials tend to kind of dissuade themselves from joining some of those online matchmaking websites. So
mhm.
for me, I'm like, you know what? I'm not necessarily taking this seriously. I'll join. I got on the website. The second day that I was on there, this girl reaches out and she's like, "Hey, Terrence, we have a very high compatibility score on this website." So it asked 70 different questions. It created a score. Hopped on a Zoom call. She was like, "Do you mind getting on a Zoom call?" And I'm like, "That's a little formal, sure." Um, it didn't make sense at the time, Dr. Liz. So I get on the Zoom call. I thought it was gonna be 30 minutes. 4 hours later, I find out that she herself is a mental health therapist. And she said, Terrence, your story sits well with me because I work with clients who experience that every day. And she shared that her family is very strong in her faith. And we have been dating for about 3 to 4 months now. So all that to say is, again, the source of mental health for my brother's situation may
Mm,
not sound like it's tied to what my past relationship looks like, but once I dug into that scripture, I allowed those words to kind of be hidden in my heart, and I
mm.
followed kind of what God was guiding, and then something good is on the other side.
Beautiful story. Now, I do want to ask about your faith.
Mhm.
So you refer to God and you have ticked, you refer to God as God. I don't know
Yeah.
how else to say that because
Sure.
everyone might call their divine source something different.
Mhm.
Um, you see it as a religious minority. So where do you fit within that?
It's a great question because if you look at the US, technically Christianity would be considered a religious majority. When I approached this, so just for clarity, when I was younger, I went to Pentecostal church.
Mhm,
So your Pentecostal church, you have, the evidence of the Spirit and speaking in tongues, and some could consider that to be a little bit radicalized, especially if you're not really familiar with Christianity as a whole. Right now, I am in a non-denominational church. So what they do is we have conversations. Obviously, it's grounded in the truth. It's grounded in scripture, but then they also incorporate experts. So let's say we're talking about anxiety and depression. Let's look at what the scripture says about it, and then how do we implement that into our daily lives? So when I say religious minority, I think a lot of people tend to sway religion versus faith. And
mhm.
this is what you just mentioned, Dr. Liz. I firmly do believe that a lot of people do believe in a higher being. They may call it different things. For me, I believe that faith is the supernatural way to navigate life.
Now, if I was to hire you into a workplace, um, what's the ideal working environment for you? What could I do to make sure you can thrive?
The main answer for me is collaborative. People perceiving me like, oh, he's a black guy, right? And then saying, but deep down, what are the pieces that inform who Terrence is? And these are those identities. So in a workplace, collaborative to say, hey, Terrence, I know that you lived out west before. Tell me what the culture is like out there,
Mhm.
right? But it's fully knowing who the team is. And I think a collaborative atmosphere truly does accentuate people's strengths, and then obviously the opportunities that they can work on to make us be a better group as a whole.
So, okay, I want to ask, what kind of leader creates a team for you where you can really feel your authentic self, that you can just be you and share yourself?
So we may not have all the answers. And a leader that's able to say, you know what, Terrence, I can sympathize with what you're talking about. I can't necessarily empathize because I haven't been there. But you know what? I read this book, and this book really helped inspire someone who went through a similar situation. And I'd love to share that book with you. So, the resourcefulness of that leader is acknowledging that I might not be the person that could speak truth to power in this specific situation, but I have the resource available in order to help you. And then down the road, that truly helps your employee. And it also feeds into that retention as well.
Okay, cool. If I was your colleague and I
Mhm,
saw you struggling at work, that maybe you just weren't yourself, something was going on,
mhm.
what are some tips you might have for them on how they can offer some support?
Dr. Liz, you used this word earlier, authenticity. So if I were to be struggling, I think if a peer or even a leader were to say, hey, Terrence, we don't even have to be on Zoom. Let me just give you a phone call. What exactly, how are you feeling? What's going on? What can I do to help support you? And I think just truly asking how that person's impacted and not, applying a cookie cutter, one size fits all attempt at fixing something. I think that treating that person as an individual, because again, you're blind to all that person's past, treating them as an individual off the cuff, I think that that truly will create and instill some of that trust.
Yeah, we often hear the pushback for inclusion saying, how can we treat every employee like an individual? That's too hard.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, but we all work with individuals. So how hard can it be? But so thanks for pointing out approaching people as individuals and just asking the question how you can support, and don't apply your assumptions to what you think they need. Just ask.
Exactly, and I'll also offer this, Dr. Liz. I'm sure you've probably read the book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team,
Mhm.
right? And one of those dysfunctions of a team is the team not building trust. And to me, you only build trust when you truly understand what that person's willing to share, but mainly what motivates them. You're in a rut right now, and maybe there's a lot of external things going on, but how can I eliminate that hurdle for you so that you're a more of a productive employee? And I truly think that that's important.
So one of the other identities that you had was around cognitive disability, and you mentioned
Mhm,
that you got diagnosed with ADHD, was it?
mhm. Correct.
In your senior year of school. So what did that diagnosis mean for you, and how did it change things?
I had a teacher that had me for the second time in her class. And she, my senior year, she's like, Terrence, do you mind staying after class? And I'm like, sure, I'll stay after class. So she meets with me and she's like, Terrence, you are absolutely a class clown. You're making everybody get distracted, but I don't think you're doing it on purpose. And I truly want you to get tested for ADHD. So I get tested for ADHD and they say, yep, you have the combined types. From a cognitive perspective, taking that medicine definitely level set the playing field because let's say I'm reading something and I'm not fully retaining or comprehending what that article or that particular textbook is about, that puts me behind my peers.
Yeah.
So being prescribed that medicine, the stimulant, allowed me to focus more, and it also allowed me to be less moody. And I think that's a symptom of ADHD a lot of people forget, but people with ADHD, because their focus is mismanaged, right? So sometimes they can be hyper focused and then sometimes not focused at all. Because it's mismanaged, those people tend to be moody, up and down. And for me, it's like if I could create an atmosphere where my loved ones are like, okay, the smiley Terrence I'm getting today is the Terrence I'm getting consistently, right? Then that makes me be a better person. So it was definitely advantageous for me.
Thank you for sharing the medication story as well,
Mhm.
because I think there's this sort of stigma with medication for whether it's neurodiversity or
Mm,
for mental illness. For me, I had sertraline, or an antidepressant, subscribed for my anxiety
mhm,
a long time ago, like 15 years ago now. And I didn't know I needed it, if that makes sense,
mhm,
until I took it and went, holy, is
mm.
this what it feels like to be normal? Everyone should also know that medication doesn't eliminate things. It
That's
just
right.
makes things a little easier. Anyway, so I think we need to share more about the medication side of things, because it's not necessarily a bad thing. But also not everyone needs it. It's just
I
there if it's needed.
I 100% agree. And hindsight's 2020, right? I wish I could have had that medicine all of my high school years and maybe I would have landed somewhere better. But I will also add to your point, for me, specifically for ADHD, there's stimulants, there's non-stimulants, and obviously the doctor is the one that's going to say, you know what, this works best for you. And
Yeah.
just because a friend is using something doesn't mean that you need to be on it. It's fascinating because for me, you'll see me with my Red Bull, right? So, because this is a stimulant in itself, you have yours too, Dr. Liz. And because this is a stimulant in itself, it allows me to have vitality of mind. It makes me sharper than if I weren't on it, but that's just because it's me. And that's full circle back to your identity and who you are and what works best for you.
Yes, absolutely. It has been a terrific conversation with you today, Terrance, and I think we could go
Likewise.
on and on and on. I feel so many similarities with you,
Yes.
including being the distracting kid in class, but not
Yeah.
deliberately. I just wanted to keep people entertained and engaged in the
We
learning.
want it to be lively. We want the English lesson about Shakespeare to also be fun, right?
Yes, not every teacher appreciated that, turns out. Um,
That's
now,
right.
how are you bringing your magic to the world? How are you making a difference?
I will answer that by saying I'm still a work in progress and I'm not perfect. To me, I'm bringing it to the world by people just seeing me how I am. And I think, if somebody tries to create a front for themselves, somebody's always going to see through it. So for me, what are the main pinnacles of who Terrence is, right? So it's ambition, it's my work, but it also is my faith. And living that out on a normal basis is how I kind of show myself to the world and try to make that impact.
Certainly sounds like you are trying to really ensure you lead by example by bringing your authentic self to the world.
That's
So I'm
it.
sure we're all grateful for it, but which also circles us back to my favorite learning moment of today's session, which is when, if we can really create a world where people don't have to pretend to be something that they're not, that they don't
Yes.
have to mask, they don't have
Mhm.
to put effort in to fit in, because as soon as you don't have to expend that energy,
Mm.
they get to contribute in so many more magical ways and share their capability and contribution and be valued and thrive. Thank you so much, Terrance.
Of course. Thank you, doctor.